It was with not an unreasonable amount of glee that back in 2022 I saw the announcement that the EA Skate franchise was coming back. At time of writing, the game isn't out yet, but my opinion on the matter has soured significantly over the past couple of years ever since I learned that it was going to be a free-to-play game. And free-to-play games by EA are never a good combination. I'm going to make an educated assumption and say it's probably going to be heavily restrictive and basically have no content unless you're willing to spend stupid amounts of money. And I'm also going to assume that it's going to be always online, and therefore as soon as they want to pull the plug, the game will basically cease to exist and we will have yet another reason to lament the state of the modern industry. But for those of you who aren't aware of the EA Skate franchise, and to those of you wanting to take a trip down memory lane, allow me to reacquaint you or acquaint you with the EA Skate franchise and what made it so awesome. And in the end, what ultimately killed it. Spoilers, it was EA. So if you're too young to remember 2007, and isn't that a depressing thought, let me take you back. In this particular era, the series that ruled the roost as far as skateboarding video games were the Tony Hawk games. But by 2007, the series had been going on for almost a decade and had long since lost much of its steam. Particularly due to the fact that they had basically run out of new mechanics to add to the games, and partially due to general burnout, having made at least one new game every year since 1999. Plus, to be quite frank, Tony Hawk's star had faded quite a bit. It's a name that didn't quite carry as much weight as it did. Audiences had seemingly long jumped off the bandwagon of the Tony Hawk series, but it was still the defining voice of this subgenre of games. That defining voice being over-the-top arcade action where you could do 900 spins on flats and no drop was too big for you to land. It was understood that that was what skateboarding games were and what fans of skateboarding games wanted, but only because nobody had really tried anything else on a major level. The most recent game that had tried a more realistic take on skateboarding gameplay that made any significant waves whatsoever was Thrasher Skate and Destroy back in 1999. But with the audience of Tony Hawk games seemingly growing weary of the repetitive formula, there was a gap in the market for something different, a brand new take on skateboarding video games to really reignite the stagnant genre. So it fell to a little company based out of Burnaby, British Columbia called EA Black Box to capitalize. EA Black Box at this point were most famous for their work on the Need for Speed franchise. They weren't the original developers, but they were the main developers for a time. But while racing and skateboarding are two very different things, they were both extreme sports characterized by being counterculture. So there were worse developers to pick, and what they came up with was an open-world skateboarding simulation. Their entire take on skateboarding video games was specifically designed to be slower paced, more realistic, more grounded, and ultimately more akin to what skateboarding is in real life. Now, and let me make this perfectly clear, it's not exactly like it is in real life, because in real life, most of these tricks would result in you impaling yourself with your own shin bones. There is an element of elevated reality here for the sake of making a fun video game, but the stated goal was to essentially be as realistic as possible while still being fun. That was basically the mission statement for the entire Skate trilogy. The first game, which came out in 2007, pretty much set the bar for the entire trilogy to follow. And surprisingly, EA Skate was basically fully formed from moment one. There's a real sense of authenticity to this game and how it emulates skateboarding culture. The opening cinematic is filmed to emulate the irreverent style of skateboarding videos, where everyone's completely self-aware and everything is ridiculous. You, the faceless protagonist, gets hit by a bus, and as such, they need to take you in an ambulance and hilarity ensues. Culminating with them operating on you with a whole bunch of ridiculous power tools while Slayer's Raining Blood plays. And I'm not crazy about a lot of the soundtrack in this game, but I had a smile on my face you could not remove with a sandblaster when I heard that combined with this scene. And everyone's played by a different professional skater from the era. Like, this just feels like it captures the very zeitgeist of skateboarding culture. Even if you're not necessarily seeing any skateboarding right now. Full disclosure, I skateboarded from 2011 through to about 2016, which is when life sort of took over. Either way, it's a subculture I'm oh so familiar with. Like, I remember back in high school, a couple of guys I knew had a skateboarding channel, and I distinctly remember there was this one skateboarding tutorial they did where between explaining how to do the trick, it just cuts to one of the other guys in the video who was like dying because he ate too many Viagra pills. It was the most ridiculous thing, but that's the sort of irreverence that skateboarding culture carries, and as dumb as it is, I had a smile on my face the whole time. Now, each of these professional skaters are also people you meet throughout the game. The story of the game is that one story that every skateboarding video game has where you're not already famous, because there's only so many stories you can do with a skateboard. Basically, you're some nondescript nobody and you're attempting to make it big. You start out doing simple challenges and eventually you gain more clout and work your way up to get sponsors and get into bigger events until you eventually find yourself at the mecca of skateboarding, the X Games. You know, it's not exactly the most in-depth thing in the world, but it gets the job done, and part of the challenge of the game is facing off against every pro skateboarder you meet so you can unlock their gear as well as unlock them as a playable character. In this respect, Danny Way is positioned as the top of the pile, seeing as he's the final one you have available to unlock, and fittingly so. Danny Way is the best skateboarder in history who nobody knows about. He never had as much media coverage as other skateboarders, but very few people have the distinction of outright inventing a style of skateboarding. He invented the mega ramp style, cause the dude is nuts. He's also to this day probably my favorite skateboarder, and I even met him once at an event where he was promoting his documentary. Couldn't have been nicer. Anyways, aside from the opening cutscene, the entire game is practically focus tested to be as authentic as possible. Like when you're at skateboarding competitions and the MC is making all these dumb cheesy jokes into the mic while you're skating.
I was thinking about you falling and then you did. It was so cool.
I can close my eyes and imagine myself at 16 watching a skateboarding competition at my local park. Like, I remember there was this one time where there was a competition being run by this guy who called himself Hippie Mike. I was sitting on the sidelines and he was talking about how much chaos was going on, and he turned to the kid next to him and said, "Hey, can you spell chaos?" And the kid says CHOS, and without missing a beat, Mike just says, "That's right, there's a lot of choss going on." So you can really tell the developers made sure to nail down the feel of the game, but there are a few things that didn't really age well, and I think the first and most evident example would be the visuals. Obviously, 2007, the game doesn't look as crisp as it once did, but that's not the issue. The issue is the visual style. I know exactly what they were going for here. I've seen skateboarding videos, and I know that they were specifically making the game to look like it was being shot by an actual person with an actual camera skating behind you. The problem is that only extends so far. Cutting the corners off to make it look like it's being filmed with a fisheye lens, I'm down with that. I actually like that idea. The low angle, it's not ideal, but it's acceptable. But where I draw the line is the fact that the majority of this game looks like it's being shot by a camera that has its exposure set too high, so the sky and anything bright is completely blown out. And that makes the visuals hard to make out at times, and it's just not visually appealing whatsoever. That's one of those cases where they should have implemented artistic license and just understood that sometimes authenticity should bow to decent visuals. No amount of fiddling with the brightness settings will fix this, it just makes the blown out sky more gray than white. Still, if you're willing to put up with that, the visuals get the job done. Gameplay-wise, as I said, Skate 1 starts the series as it means to go on, cause obviously, since this was intended to be a more realistic take on skateboarding, they needed something to emulate how difficult skateboarding actually is, because it is really difficult. Sometimes you're spending hours for less than a minute of usable footage. In this case, they emulate that by having a stick flick system, where you flick the right analog stick in a specific direction to do flip tricks. Going straight up and straight down will do your standard ollie, but doing it up and to the right will do a kickflip, doing a quarter rotation from the middle will do a pop shove it, doing a half rotation from either the left or the right will do a 360 shove it, and of course doing the opposite motion from the top down will result in nollie tricks. Basically, you need incredibly precise fingers to do whatever trick you want to do, and this is a system that takes a very long time to even get good at. Even after many years, I'm still not 100% accurate. I may have been able to pick this game up after not playing the skate games for a decade and know exactly what to do, but even then I still routinely f**k up. I would say for every one successful attempt at a specific line, I have 5 unsuccessful attempts, which once again is keeping with the spirit. I have to sift through hours worth of footage to find the bright spots, but it's an incredible challenge, and my god is it satisfying when you finally nail those tricks. Getting that exact precise movement that you were looking for to finally nail what you were going for. Admittedly, I do abuse the 360 hard flip a bit much because it's one of the most complex skateboarding maneuvers you can do, and it's matched by the input required to do it. A 2/3 clockwise rotation from the right, followed by a diagonal flick to the right, but naturally it gives you the most amount of points of all the flip tricks. Admittedly, I would say through about 80 to 90% of the game, it doesn't really matter what kind of tricks you're doing, because most of the challenges are more about the amount of points or the variety of tricks. Granted, there are times when a specific trick does matter, and that's when things can get a bit finicky. Sometimes the game will just blatantly register something as a completely different trick. I distinctly remember trying to do a pop shove it and somehow doing a kickflip at one point. That's an entirely separate motion. It might have to do with the controller, it might have to do with the fact that I'm emulating, but either way, I had trouble with specific tricks a lot of the time, and that's especially bad in games of Skate, which is the Skate equivalent of the game Horse, where one person sets the trick and the other person has to repeat it. Thankfully, nothing about this game is too hard in that respect. Most people will bail pretty frequently, because apparently the game is just as hard for them. I've heard it said that this game has the most realistic and therefore most difficult physics in the trilogy. I'm not sure if that's entirely true, but I did notice that despite immediately knowing the controls, I felt that I was bailing more in this game than any of the other games in the trilogy, which is not to say it's bad. I think the balance is just fine. Hell, they didn't even increase the difficulty if you were in switch stance. And trust me, trying to skate in switch stance is like trying to learn to steer your car with your feet. The only changes to switch stance is that your flip trick inputs will be mirrored, so to do a heel flip, for example, instead of flicking to the left, you flick to the right. And also your push controls are mirrored. Yeah, this game has individual push buttons for each individual leg, and depending on your stance, if you're in switch, your front leg is now your back leg, therefore you push Mongo with that button, which may seem rather inconsequential, but if there's one rule you must know about skateboarding, it's that you do not push Mongo. You never go full Mongo. To anybody who doesn't know the lingo, it must sound like I'm speaking a completely different language. So the controls are a compelling challenge to master, and had I not already had years of experience, I'd imagine this would be actually quite frustrating to get into, and that's why these games are slightly more for the enthusiast rather than the average person looking for a fun game, because my god, it is not easy. Although despite playing tons of 2 and 3, I never actually played Skate 1. All I ever heard was that it was a downgraded version of the other two, and I wouldn't even necessarily say that. The only thing I noticed is that it's a bit obnoxious to get around because you can't get off your skateboard. Otherwise, this game is exactly what you would expect. With skateboarding games, it's often the case where the world is built for the sake of skateboarding, and as such, a lot of the architecture just looks unnatural. Whereas this looks entirely legit most of the time, like actual plazas and modern art that you may run into in real life. And the open world is fun in the sense that there are so many different places to organically stumble across where you can do all these insane sequences completely off the cuff. I would say that's the biggest advantage of the open world, but I don't really think it has much value beyond the aimless f***ing about though. Because the primary enjoyment in this game is going to be in the mission string, and you can automatically warp to wherever you need to go as far as the missions. They make a big deal out of having to use the subway to get around, but the subway is entirely worthless as soon as you realize you can just highlight any activity and instantly teleport there. So would this game really be any different if it were just a series of levels akin to Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4 where you skate around and find objectives? Who's to say, but I will acquiesce to the fact that this game being one cohesive world does lend it a bit of novelty, and when I say that the sandbox doesn't really have much purpose other than aimless f***ing about, I mean, what's the point of any open world at that point? And even though this is during a period where the sandbox genre was still very new and as such they were still trying to figure out the correct way to do things, the progression feels very organic. Basically, you have 2 meters you have to fill up. One for something imaginatively titled The Skateboarding Mag, and another for Thrasher. If you're unfamiliar, Thrasher is basically the premier skateboarding magazine in the world, and by doing certain activities, you're able to fill the meter up until you progress to the next point, therefore you're able to progress your career to the next level, and therefore unlock the next set of missions. Generally, you have to do most of these missions to fill up the meters, but not all the time. There is a degree of picking and choosing, and you can pick whatever order you want, at least of the available missions. And they also have a very organic game mode where you can just activate spur-of-the-moment filming sessions to fill up one of the 2 meters. And in that case, you're given a specific set of objectives to do in a certain amount of time. But you're able to activate them whenever, so you can find the perfect spot you want to do them in. Granted, this probably means you're going to end up doing a lot of missions in the same area, assuming you can find a good spot. And half of these you can absolutely cheese once you unlock the X Games arena. But by that point, you probably don't need to do the tasks anyway. And that X Games challenge? Winning that is quite the accomplishment. They make you work for it. Overall, the unimaginatively titled Skate was a success in pretty much every way. It had a few kinks it needed to iron out, but generally speaking it hit all the right notes, and it was the shot in the arm that the subgenre of games needed. Desperately. Hence why a year and a half later, the unimaginatively titled Skate 2 came out. Now, full disclosure, this was the game that I started with. Where was I first introduced to the game? Well, I feel like this is a running joke at this point because this is how my story with Grand Theft Auto, Assassin's Creed, Dead Rising, Infamous, and a number of other franchises started. My sister bought the game, I backseated a lot of it with her, and I eventually played it myself. While Skate 2 isn't vastly better than the first game, it feels like the type of iteration that effectively replaces the previous entry in the same way successive Madden games replace previous entries. Because while skateboarding is more conducive to video games than other sports games, the skate games are still grounded enough in reality to essentially be replaceable in that way. Maybe you disagree, that's fine. But Skate 2 really does come across as a refinement that doesn't concern itself with reinventing the wheel. The plot this time around is pretty much a repeat outside of the opening cinematic, which is fair enough because the plot of Skate 1 doesn't really end. Yeah, that's kind of the one thing I'm not a fan of in this series. Even though the intended final challenge will usually be some major competition, there's no specifically designated point where the game ends and the credits roll. It kind of just goes on forever, leaving all three games to sort of peter out by the end, which is fine because you're not here for the story. But if you have even the most passing of passing interest in the story of this game, your character, still the faceless, unnamed protagonist, for some reason went to jail for 5 years between games, and the intro cinematic is you being let out of jail. Much like the first game where you're allegedly being operated on by a bunch of different famous skateboarders after getting hit by a bus. In this case, all the inmates and all the guards are also pro skaters. Some new, some returning. It occurs to me that given that this is supposed to be completely tongue-in-cheek, I wonder how much of this is supposed to be canon to the actual game. I mean, they literally mention that he gets out of jail in the game, so who knows?
Yo, my friend here just got out the joint, so we had to hit you up.
Now, what is it about this game that makes it a functional replacement of Skate 1? Well, admittedly, there are certain things about it that I have a personal bias over. The soundtrack, for example. I wouldn't even say that the soundtrack is better, it's just I'm more familiar with this one. Motorhead, Black Sabbath, Judas Priest, Dragon Force, Rage Against the Machine. It's like a who's who of all my favorite bands when I was in high school. Also, you have Shockwave by Black Tide. Man, I loved Black Tide back in the day, especially this song. The lyrics sucked, but man, those guitar riffs are juicy. It's a shame too, Black Tide had the potential to be the next Metallica. They had a great sound and they were young. I think the lead singer was 15 when they first broke into mainstream notoriety. Unfortunately, they decided to shift their sound in later albums into a more metalcore direction, and due to various issues, the band no longer exists. What a shame. Kinda reminds me of what happened to Crooked X, another young band with a lot of potential that was squandered. Sorry, what was I talking about? Oh yeah, there are some things that aren't metal that I quite enjoy. Electric Light Orchestra, that's always a classic. The Clash, some classic punk rock, and that song Death or Glory, that lives rent-free in my head. I love the soundtrack, but that's entirely my biased perspective. The game is mostly identical, but as far as major functional improvements, they begin with the world itself. Now, apparently between the events of the first and second game, as a matter of fact, before the events of the spin-off Skate It, the city that the first two games are set in, San Vanalona, was hit by a series of earthquakes that leveled the city. And so in the 5 years you've been in prison, the place was rebuilt. Sorry I had to make you spare precious mental RAM to internalize the canon of the Skate games. Apparently this was just so they had an excuse to make the city empty and skate it, because that was a Wii/DS game, and they needed the extra resources. Either way, the city had been rebuilt, and I feel like the design is quite a bit better. I feel like the city is shaped more like a long oval, where the top is very narrow and there are only a few places you can go, but as you go from the top of the mountain called Cougar Mountain, boy, that was a running joke between me and my sister back in the day. But as you ride down Cougar Mountain, the explorable area gradually sprawls out to include more of the mountain and eventually becomes the most sprawling as you get into the downtown and old town areas, but then it starts to narrow and narrow and narrow, funneling you into the central point of the beach. Meanwhile, it felt like it was hard to explore the bottom portion of the map in the first game because it sprawled out and never narrowed. It was like a long triangle, therefore the bottom half of the map felt a bit chaotically big and difficult to explore. It wasn't bad by any means, but I feel like focusing the sprawling elements in the middle makes the map flow a lot better. It's like you start at the same point and you end at the same point, but everything in between is always a unique experience. Plus, they turned the dial as far as being fantastical. The new city is filled to the brim with ridiculously over-the-top architecture and set pieces, and they make the most of it with the mission string. They did remove the organic parts of the progression, that is to say the parts where you're given a goal and free reign to do whatever you want, wherever you want. Therefore, the game is mostly a linear sequence of tasks, but I'd say they more than make up for it in other areas. The trade-off to all the new fantastical architecture is that there are a lot of restricted areas patrolled by the hardest of hard-ass guards that make it damn near impossible to do what you need to do to pass missions. Both these things existed in the first game, but they were so rare and so insubstantial I barely even noticed. But you're given a solution in the form of Big Black. If you're familiar with the work of Rob Dyrdek, or as I affectionately call him, Rob Drydick, you know all about his sidekick Big Black. Everything you need to know about him is contained in his nickname. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us, as he passed away back in 2017. Apparently, the bigness of him unfortunately caught up to him. But in this game, Homie's immortalized as your bouncer. You call him up, pay him a couple hundred smackers, and he keeps the security off your back for a couple of minutes while you handle the grown-up business. Pretty sure that's illegal, but what are you gonna do? This is part of their endeavor to give you more things to do with your money other than spend it on cosmetics, and if you're like me and don't really care about the cosmetic aspects of the game, you're probably not even gonna change out of your default outfit, at least not until you get some sponsors and therefore you get some money for wearing your brand's logo. The customization is nice, but I didn't even bother all that much. Although it's notable that you can actually skate as a girl in this game. I would have skated as a girl, though I wanted to carry my same character over from game to game. Called him Jagballs. I tried to make him look like a grown-up version of what I looked like as a teenager, but I think I ended up just making a cross between Johnny Gat and Robbie Rotten. But as far as money is concerned, there are multiple services you can pay for. One of which is the ability to drain pools, which is contextual and only used in a couple of spots in the entire game. But then you have Mike's uncapping service. This is a very real thing where modern architecture is specifically designed to prevent people from skating on them. But this guy Mike endeavors to remove the barriers to truly great skateboarding for a fee, of course. You can still work your way around it, but it's far easier not to. The one thing that sucks is that you can't use the uncapping service if you're in the middle of a mission. To use it, you have to quit out of the mission first, which is just more trouble than it's worth half the time. But with that said, capped spots are actually pretty rare. I had to search for like 20 minutes just to find one to demonstrate the mechanic. I think part of what makes the world's architecture feel a bit more grandiose comes down to the fact that there's a significantly increased focus on verticality. There are so many big areas that build into big drops for you to play around with, and I feel like the increased focus on verticality comes down to one thing, and that's your ability to actually get off your skateboard and walk around. And now that's breaking new ground, showing that skateboarders actually have feet. Therefore, the map doesn't have to be built around the idea you can't go upstairs, and therefore, you have a lot more stairs. Hilariously, the ability to get off your skateboard also begets a feature wherein your skateboarder is evidently force sensitive, but only towards his skateboard, so he can summon it at will. That's awesome. Granted, the on-foot controls are awkward as all get out. Trying to navigate this one stair set to get up to this Danny Way mission takes forever. Plus, I'd imagine that the ability to get off your board was seen as a bit of an afterthought and a bit of a means to an end, therefore it wasn't tested very well, hence the most famous glitch in the series and for its time possibly one of the more famous glitches in games generally. If you do a specific button combination that involves getting on your board while doing a grab, you'll clip yourself into the ground and launch yourself into the air. It's hard to do, and actually getting a launch that's good enough to make you go flying but not so intense that you instantly reset is like 1 in 20. At least in my experiences. But it's really fun, and it's also the thing that makes the Hall of Meat minigame trivial at times. More on that in a minute. Personally, I think if it was the ability to get on and off your board that made them able to open up the game so much, then I applaud them for that because so many missions are built around these insane stunts, working on a ridiculous scale. Dropping 200 feet off this sign, or this 100-foot drop off a dilapidated apartment building, or the murder horn. This is the #1 activity I spend my time doing in this game once it's properly unlocked. Once you get past a certain point in the game, Sammy, the person who drains the pools, will then drain the dam, allowing you to do a trick into the dam. This spot is called the Murder Horn. It is so much fun, and you get so much speed that you're almost out of control by the time you reach the ground. And once you get past the dam, you find yourself in a race course, and I've never been able to do the entire course after dropping in on the dam, but I will still try it a million times. Unfortunately, this Murder Horn drop was actually denied to me growing up, because for some reason my PS3, and my PS3 specifically, had some sort of weird issue where in Skate 2, after a certain point, missions stopped showing up. Therefore, I could never progress far enough to be able to do the Murder Horn. So I have a bit of a psychological complex in that respect. The same thing weirdly happens to Red Dead Redemption Undead Nightmare. For some reason, after a certain point, missions just stopped showing up for no discernible reason. It's funny though, many of these large drop-in missions are optional, and the only thing you unlock is a bunch of spawn points for large drop-ins to play around with. And that's a-okay for me. More drop-ins, more tricks, and all the more chances to get injured. This is the biggest improvement in all of Skate 2. Now, if you're familiar with Thrasher's Hall of Meat, it is essentially a celebration of skateboarders eating shit. Just montages of the most brutal bales you'll see. They turned this into a game mode. This was a thing in the first game as well, but it wasn't particularly fleshed out. And also, there weren't a ton of high places to throw yourself off of. It was an afterthought, but in this game, they turn it into a game, where you have 4 separate types of bail conditions you can pull off, and each list gradually gets harder, and because they decided to make this a large part of the challenge, the game is practically built around getting the most spectacular bails, and the physics are as such that it feels quite satisfying to go ass over tea kettle at 100 miles per hour. You can practically feel the impact of flesh on concrete with every fall. You can practically feel the bones crushing and the ribs shattering as you fall down over and over and over. And as sadistic as it sounds, there is something so viscerally enjoyable about that. The benefit of the fact that these games are going for heightened realism is the fact that the physics feel very heavy, and so do you. So it doesn't even bother me when I don't land a trick, because landing it or completely bailing still gives me the same visceral enjoyment. It's one of the things that makes this game feel like an improvement to the point of being a replacement, because there's not really that much to say about these specific mechanics, as they were almost universally carried over. And it's one of those rare cases where I think EA did the right thing by not messing with the formula that worked. I mean, there are a few new features, like the ability to make your own skate spots, but that's not worth remarking on. So Skate 2 is almost the same, but still an improvement over Skate 1. But it has one fatal flaw. It is impossibly hard at times. There are 2 specific instances in this game which can absolutely go fuck themselves. First of all, this mission where you have to air from one bank to the other, I swear, they did not playtest this. Because this is just shy of impossible. I'm not even kidding when I say every time I play this game, doing this mission takes an hour's worth of tries. Grinding 24 feet, easy peasy, but somehow getting the speed and angle to launch yourself across the pool, it's impossible, and every time I do it, I barely do it. Maybe there's something I'm doing wrong, but I'm following all the instructions the game tells me to do, and it seemingly never works. And the other one is the mission Can You Spell Girl? It's a game of skate between you, Eric Costin, and Mike Carroll. And my god, these people will just not bail. They will sometimes have 10 tricks in a row before they make one mistake, and the same issue as before applies. Sometimes doing specific tricks can be difficult, so doing this mission in the traditional sense might take 100 rounds. The only way to win this one is to use exploits. You can cheese this by dragging items over to the mission area, but you can also easily win by either doing triple flips or 540s. For some reason, the AI is not programmed to be able to do those, but the problem is, you need to survive long enough to get your turn. So the way I see it, you have to keep restarting the challenge until Eric Costin bails on the first attempt, which will take a number of retries. Then you have to wait for Mike Carroll to bail. If you're waiting for the RNG to have both of them bail naturally, it's not worth it. Then assuming you survive long enough to get to your turn, you have to break out the 540s. If you can do 5 different 540 tricks in a row, or at least without bailing or repeating a trick, you're golden. But either way, that was a major pain in my ass growing up, and those are only the 2 biggest ones I can think of off the top of my head. There were other egregious stumbling blocks as well. Like this one mission called Vert with the Vampire, you have to do a few tasks in a very short amount of time, one of which is airing up to the windows. The whole pumping to gain speed thing is all well and good, but it seems like it's a crapshoot to know whether or not you're actually going to get the height you need to make, or if you're just going to fail. And fail I did, several times. I've never known the differentiating factor between success and failure, and I also have issues anytime you have to hand plant, in particular this one mission where you have to do a hand plant on an elevated rail, but the rail is situated slightly back from the half pipe, and trying to do a hand plant on the rail was nigh impossible because trying to get the physics to make you go just forward enough to be able to connect to the handrail without pushing you into the walkway was like threading a needle with boxing gloves on. But also special mention to that one mission where you have to hand plant on the top of a basketball hoop, which wouldn't be so hard if the physics could be relied upon to do the same thing every time. But there's no way to know if you're going to line up with the basketball hoop properly as you approach, or if you're just going to biff it. So the game is unfortunately inconsistent in its difficulty, and when it gets hard, it gets hard. But other than that, it's a swell time every time. I could pop this game on and mess around with it any day of the week. And more than anything, there's only one other game I can think of where throwing yourself into traffic is this rewarding. And this led to the third and final game in the mainline Skate series, Skate 3. This time coming out just over a year after the previous game, which really surprises me, given how much they were able to accomplish in that time. With that said, I have a complicated relationship with this game. In many ways, it's my favorite game in the trilogy, but it also drops the ball in a few areas. The game opens up with the now mandatory irreverent live-action cinematic, this time depicting a whole bunch of pro skateboarders as they're working for a factory creating skateboards. As always, it's entertaining, and this time the connecting tissue to your faceless, nameless character is that he attempts to do this crazy stunt on TV, and it goes completely wrong. But instead of using this as an opportunity to have you injured or fall from grace or whatever, it instead leads into a plot about your filmer Giovanni Rita insisting that you need to stop working for the man and start making it on your own.
Let's do our own thing. Let's start our own board company. Let's start the illest board company. You just keep skating and do what you do best.
Yeah, Rita was the camera following you in the first two games. Before now, he is just used as justification for the camera that follows you around, because he's carrying the literal physical camera that is the view through which we see the game. And in this case, he's replaced by a guy named Shingo. I don't know who any of these people are. I at least have a passing familiarity with most of the pro skaters, but these two guys beats me. In any case, this is once again about as involved a story as you can get for this level of groundedness. You decide to create your own brand. Of course, my brand is the same as my character name, Jagballs, and the team that I sign are all named variations of that, including Jag, JB, and BJ. Functionally speaking, the progression in this game is sort of a combination of the first and second game. It has the linear progression of the second game, while also having an experience bar in the form of the amount of boards you've sold. And for every milestone you pass, you unlock a new area to customize, as well as the occasional major story mission. So yeah, it's a good setup. It allows the tasks and general difficulty to escalate naturally, and the linear story missions are about as good as you could hope for this sort of thing. And unlike last time, we don't have any major stumbling blocks. It's a nice steady uphill curve that never goes over the top. Plus, even though I usually don't f*** with the tutorial missions in these games unless I have to, I decided to this time around, mostly because of Coach Frank, because he's really entertaining.
Here, you're gonna learn the basics, you're gonna get good, and if you don't, I'm gonna break your board! Coach Frank.
And if you happen to recognize that character being portrayed by none other than Jason Lee of My Name is Earl fame, then congratulations, you know what's up. But right from the beginning, there are a number of things that stick out to me as having dropped the ball. The first one is the soundtrack. I think this might actually be the worst soundtrack of the three by a significant margin, though that is subjective. The first game was a lot of music that I could listen to with a few bangers here and there. The second game was 80 to 90% classic, but this game has so much nothing. A lot of it is just mediocre punk rock. Now here's the thing, I like punk rock when there's a melody and a singer that sounds like they're actually trying. Bad Religion and the Dead Kennedys are probably my favorites, but a lot of the punk rock on this soundtrack just feels like people randomly hitting their instruments while the quote-unquote singer just yells into the mic. It's not good in my opinion. Then you have some eccentric pop like Goodbye Horses and Going Up the Country, some decent rap, and maybe like 4 or 5 songs that I actually like. The main theme, Coming Home by Cheeseburger, is pretty good. Psychedelic Reggae by Tommy Cook and the Supersonics is pretty good, and the only two songs that I would actually put on a playlist to listen to in my spare time would be Eyes of a Panther by Steel Panther, that ironic 80s hair metal throwback band, which I swear weren't a thing in 2011, but apparently they were, and the other one is Immortal by Dream Evil. Otherwise, this soundtrack is just weak. I'm much better putting on my own music, but even then, that's still a fairly minor issue. The most major issue you're going to notice playing this game, especially after playing the second game, is that the physics feel really weak. The first two games felt really heavy, but you'll feel noticeably lighter in this game, meaning the skateboarding feels less challenging as you float quite a bit more. And also the biggest downgrade is the bailing, as well as the Hall of Meat. It's just not fun to bail anymore. You hit the ground like a partially filled water balloon instead of a sack of meat. They made the Hall of Meat a slightly elaborate game mode where you have to do specific tasks from a vantage point, and the different poses you can do now give you specific functions. Like in Cannonball Pose, you can kick off the ground, and Spread Eagle Pose, you can glide because that makes sense. In Torpedo Pose, you can spin rapidly, and I've never been quite sure what the function of the Judo Pose is. It kind of just misses the point in both directions, because part of the appeal of Hall of Meat was how it organically weaved itself into gameplay. It wasn't some hard and fast game mode you could simply activate. Although you can set it so the Hall of Meat mode activates in the same way the Hall of Meat mode was active in the previous game, but even then we still have to deal with the fact that it just doesn't feel as viscerally satisfying to bail anymore, so this game kind of took a step away from realism, and I feel like it's worse off for it. As a matter of fact, the lighter physics, the slightly fantastical elements in how you can now do things like glide, the overall ridiculously bright and sunny look to the entire game. I have a theory that Buddy Boy died during this stunt in the opening cinematic, and this is his personal heaven. A beautiful land of endless skateboarding possibilities where nothing as harsh as security will ever get in your way again. Yeah, there's no security in this game, although if you knock the same pedestrian down a few times, they will beat you up or in some cases tase you. But yeah, that's one of those things that I always thought was a bit weird about this game, was how bright and sterile the game world looks. Compare that to the previous game, which had a certain grittiness and griminess to the world, and this just feels comparatively unreal. Although I will say I do appreciate the fact that they did take a few steps to improve the aesthetic in these games in the sense that they removed the overexposed look to the visuals. Though they also took away the fisheye look, which I'm not the biggest fan of. That was authenticity without getting in the way. Outside of the slightly less satisfying physics, does this game do anything new? Well, this time, instead of having one connecting sandbox, it now has 3 smaller sandboxes that exist independent of each other. I actually quite like that idea. It means you can have very distinctive areas without them clashing with each other. You know, you can't drive for 2 minutes outside of the city and find yourself in a quarry, for example. So there's an increase in variety of locations, and the scale that they play around with is absolutely ridiculous. I'm not kidding when I say everything feels slightly bigger in this game, and there are a few instances where there are opportunities for absolutely ridiculous, unrealistic tricks, like this one area with a massive drop into a staircase. I was trying to do this for like a half hour, but I finally nailed it. There's also this one pipe I wanted to ride all the way down, and that took multiple tries, but I finally rode all the way down and did a nice little trick at the end. There's also this area where you can gap an entire bridge, and there's this massive drop off a gantry crane, which you can only access by activating a specific Hall of Meat challenge and quitting out. Now, I did try for like an hour to drop into whatever this is below, but I could never nail it. I do distinctly remember nailing it back in the day though, but the only evidence I have is this crappy camcorder footage filmed off my TV. So the scale of everything does make up for the shortcoming of the physics in many ways, and of course, if you do find the game is a bit easy, another thing they added was difficulty options. But I didn't really notice a substantial difference between easy and medium. Both of them feel fairly automated. The only thing that's not automated was hard, and I feel like hard takes things a step too far in that respect. Though it's the only difficulty where they don't automate the flips, which means it's entirely possible to do a double front flip. That's pretty sick. Either way, normal difficulty is ideal for me, or at least as ideal as you can get for this. They also added a handful of new tricks that weren't there before, underflips, dark slides, etc. It's kind of the same issue that the Tony Hawk series had after a while. After a certain point, there are only so many ways you can flip a board. And as such, you'll find yourself reaching a certain point of diminishing returns as far as what you can add. Don't get me wrong, viewers, this game is still good. Very good, in fact. It wouldn't have the fan base it has if it weren't a good game. But it feels somewhat diminished compared to its predecessors, but despite faltering in a few ways, this was also one of my most played games for a time. And a lot of that comes down to the creative elements. Specifically, the Create a Park feature. I spent dozens of hours making the absolute perfect parks. Once again, the only footage I have of these parks were recorded with a crappy camcorder, but man, I had so much fun with this. The brand ownership thing also means you have to do tasks with your employees at times, but it's really just a superficial change. Every character has pretty well the same controls, barring the looseness of your trucks or the hardness of your wheels. So it doesn't cause any issues, but it's also not really a strength, so it's a completely neutral addition. I'm struggling to think of anything else the game really does. It's one of those games where everything it does well, but everything it does well was also done well by the game that preceded it. That's not a bad thing by any means, it just means there's not a lot of fresh new additions to talk about. If I had to put my finger on the main appeal of Skate 3 compared to the other two games, I guess there's more of an easygoing nature to this game generally. It's not as intensive as far as the mental load it puts on you, where you really needed to lock in while playing the first two games. I would say that Skate 3 offers a real Zen-like experience in that regard, where you're able to just mess around in a varied world and can pretty much breeze through all the various challenges, and you get a host of really over-the-top areas to mess around in. And in that respect, what's there not to like? It may fall short in a few areas, but there's a good reason why this is one of my most all-time played games, and why it still has a cult fan base to this day. It is definitely its own unique experience compared to Skate 2 in such a way that it doesn't necessarily replace Skate 2. You can play these two games and get a completely unique experience, or at least as unique as you can get in this series. But it all ends kind of anticlimactically. Much like the other two games, once you sell 1 million boards, you unlock the final challenge, which is yet another arena showdown, and the game pretty much peters out after that. And that, as they say, is that. Yet another relatively humdrum ending for a series that pretty much specializes in that. I'm just saying, guys, a little animation of you standing on a podium getting a medal or something, followed by the credits, that would be fine. I'm not asking for much, just some closure. But of course, if it's closure you want, it's something you're not going to get from this series generally, and isn't that a segue? So what happened to the Skate franchise? To be honest, I don't think anything in particular really killed the series, unlike the many other franchises that I've talked about on this channel. I feel like they could have easily made Skate 4 after this, because by all accounts, the Skate franchise was still fairly popular by the time Skate 3 happened. Apparently it was still selling pretty well as late as 2014. And petitions to make Skate 4 were pretty frequent. I think all this comes down to is EA being EA. They are the worst game publisher, full stop. They, more than any company, are so keen to kill their own franchises and developers if they don't make all the money in the world. And presumably that's what happened here. A modest success was not enough. Hence why in 2012, EA announced a restructuring of their Canadian divisions to focus on what they considered high-growth digital formats, including social, online, and free-to-play games. It literally didn't have to be this way, and their justification for killing the series was vapid at best. Unfortunately, once the series died, the entire subgenre of skateboarding games kind of died along with it for a time. Outside of the first attempts at an HD remaster of the first two Tony Hawk games, there was a several-year period where there were basically no skateboarding games at all, and people were crying out for something. Eventually, the skateboarding genre did come back in full force with both simulation and arcade-style games, and with this era of gaming being as open as it is, we'll likely never have a dry spell like that again, and it's with that in mind that I say I would have been fine if Skate stayed dead, to be honest. Mostly because I don't think Skate was ever doing something so unique that only they could do it. I backed Session Skate Sim on Kickstarter back in 2015, back when it was called Project Session. And I remember when a trailer for that got shown at E3, there were a bunch of people getting all pissy that it wasn't Skate 4, and I was like, it's that in all but name. Why are we so attached to branding? It's completely arbitrary at this point. Admittedly though, I never actually ended up playing Session, but whoop-de-doo. Point being that there have already been several unofficial Skate 4s, and whatever this new Skate game is going to be, I don't really care because for one thing, it's not being made by the old developers because that team was disbanded years ago, and for another thing, it's a free-to-play game by EA, which is a double dose of f*** that. So if I can get the functional experience elsewhere, then I'm pretty much content getting said experience elsewhere and leaving whatever husk that EA expects to milk the goodwill from in the dust. Thank you, f*** you, bye. A little bit less sentimental this time around than other retrospectives I've done, but that's because while the death of the series in itself is sad, it's one of those cases where the spirit lives on in many places, only for those who are willing to look. And that's all I've got. If you like this video and want to support the channel, you can like this video, leave a comment telling me what you think, subscribe for more, and hit the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. And if you want to support the channel in a more direct fashion, you can pledge to my Patreon for unique perks and rewards such as early access, Discord benefits, and exclusive content along with these fine folks right here. And an extra special thank you to Dick Kickham, Gaw004, Hydra Overlord, My Name is Tank, FarmCat84, Raph, Sphinx, Weird Webster, and Will Stokes for going above and beyond. Elsewise than that, I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Stay crispy, my friends.